What's up, marketing maniacs, and welcome back to another episode of From Startup to Wunderbrand, your ultimate BFF in the wide world of digital marketing. Join me, your host, Nicholas Kuhner, spilling the beans on the juiciest trends and hottest tips to up your marketing game. And tonight we've got Carlos Alvarenga, who is an independent communications researcher, writer and coach. But that's not all. He's also doing his PhD at the moment, and we'll be talking about what that PhD is in now. But before becoming a full-time writer, he worked as a management consultant, adjunct professor at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. And prior to this, he also worked at a couple of interesting companies. So principal at Ernst & Young and a managing director at Accenture and executive director at World 50 Labs. I haven't heard of that, so you're going to have to give me a little bit of details around that. But as mentioned, currently doing his PhD in communications and rhetoric at the University of Maryland, a BA in classics and Greek. I mean, there's quite a lot of interesting studies you've got there, and you want to continue to study more. So obviously, you're a sucker for punishment, Carlos. Based on that, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
So rhetoric, that sounds like quite an old-fashioned word. And I think a lot of people, when they hear rhetoric, they think of, potentially the likes of Mussolini and Hitler and all of these bad folks. But rhetoric is not really a bad thing. I think if people think about it, we use it every day, right?
That's right. The term itself is an interesting term. It goes all the way back to ancient Greece, as most of you probably know. But it's a word in Greek, which we don't have in English. So in Greek, it's a word techne. It's where we get technique from, right? So there's no translation in English. The closest thing is something like a practical art or art with a purpose, as distinct from a decorative art. So it really is this interesting combination of art and technique. And you're right. The one thing I mentioned in the book is my metaphor for persuasion, which is how we usually translate this term, right? Although today rhetoric means a lot more than just that. It's a chemistry with words, right? Because it's chemistry with words, it's amoral. Chemistry is used to make medicine, it's used to make poison. And so in and of itself has no morality. It's just a tool that people can use for good things and they can use for bad things. You're right. Mm-hmm.
Well, you talk about that word technique, and I think people often talk about communications and messaging as an art form. But what you've mentioned, I think, in a short summary of the book that I've read, is that persuasion isn't really an art form, it is a science. And that's the technical aspects to it, which I think is something different to how it's traditionally been explained.
You're right. And it is this thing called technique, which is in between art and science, right? It has some art, but it also has some science. And I think people ignore the science. And someone asked me the other day about how does my book relate to books on the classic works on influence or negotiation? And I say, we had medicine long before we had chemistry. We knew this plant cures a headache, but we didn't know why. So my book is not medicine. My book is the chemistry that explains why that's a good book on negotiation or a good book on selling, because the chemistry is what's behind it. And the thing that I try to lay out is, if you understand the chemistry, it's largely predictable. My wife's a scientist. I can tell you that chemistry isn't always predictable, right? It requires some things can still go not how you expect it, but it's generally predictable. And that's what I say about persuasion. Persuasion is generally predictable if you understand how it works.
So you've mentioned your book a couple of times. I think we may as well tell the listener what book this is. And it's your latest book, which is The Rules of Persuasion. Right. So can you give us a bit of background to this? So Carlos, what possessed you to write this book? And obviously you're going to get a lot of people with tons of opinions on this in terms of rules.
Of course. So the origin is several years ago, I started coaching nonprofit CEOs, founders, and for pro bono. And I wanted to find a book on persuasion. And I bought a few, but they turned out they weren't about persuasion. They were about influence or psychology or manipulation or selling. There really wasn't anything that explained two things. What exactly is persuasion? How does it work? I went back to a book I'd read in college called The Rhetoric from Aristotle. And I decided that was still the most effective work to use in my coaching. Now, the interesting part is that Aristotle has a very strange feature. which is that in his writing, the more obvious something is, the less he explains. So he will go on for pages and pages about something which is complicated or obscure. This was so obvious to him that he just kind of says it and then moves on, which is a problem. So you may have read ethos, pathos, logos a million times in articles, but they're not long articles usually because people just quote this line. So I had two questions. What do you mean by ethos, pathos, logos? And for me, I don't use those terms. I use English terms, which is character, argument, and emotion. What does that mean? And then how does persuasion actually work? What is really happening? The book was my attempt to build that and also to update and expand on Aristotle, right? Adding examples from film, literature, hip hop, right? Art. And so the book is full of examples, mostly cinema, but also other media that takes what Aristotle said and updates it. So I say all I did was I modernized and expanded on his work, right, for a modern audience.
So I was going to ask you about the audience. Who is the audience for this book? Is this a technical book for folks that are going to be studying philosophy and rhetoric, or is this something that somebody can pick off the shelf and go, let me learn a little bit about persuasion and use it in my business or use it in advertising, etc.?
It's such an interesting question because when I was working on the book, my agent had the short list was two offers. One, a very prestigious UK academic press, and one, an American commercial press. And well, the academic press was going to be a $45 hardcover book sold through universities and sort of, that kind of project. And the American project was, no, we're going to put it on Amazon. It'll be on Kindle, audiobooks. It'll be $19. Anybody can buy it. I chose for this book to go with the American press because I wanted it to be read versus critiqued. If you know the difference, it was, although it has scholarship, it's not a scholarly book. Although there's a lot of research, it's not a research book. So there are a couple of hundred footnotes. The most interesting in the book is that it has 40 QR codes. And the idea is I use a lot of media to explain the points. I think it's useful, and especially a lot of YouTube videos. That's very hard to do in a book because nobody's going to copy and paste a URL from a footnote. So a friend of mine said, why not use QR codes? The problem with QR codes, each one counts as an image. And there were so many of them. So I had to go back and forth with the publisher, persuade them that the book wasn't really without the QR codes. QR codes made it in. So as you read the book, you can take out your phone, scan, takes you to YouTube, and you watch a movie clip or a speech or something, and then come back to the book and keep on reading. So it is multimedia as much as a book can be in today's age.
Well, that's such a smart way of making it multimedia, because all of us have our phones. Some of us also like having a physical copy of a book rather than just Kindle. So I think that's a good way to bridge the gap between digital and hard copy. So the book came out last year or this year, Carlos?
Last fall. Mm-hmm.
Last fall, okay. And I saw quite a lot of really positive reviews, not just from professors, but from folks in industry. And, because I run a digital marketing podcast, for me, we use persuasion every day in terms of our communications. And the one standard I use is looking at the customer journey. And at each stage, if you understand where the customer is at each particular stage of the customer journey, you're able to create content and messaging that is going to help persuade them to move to the next stage. Do you touch on any marketing concepts or persuasion in terms of buying and selling in the book?
I do. And in fact, I'm a student of advertising. So I write about, we have this ad tagline, just do it. And if you look at ad agency and magazine, all these at the end of the 20th century was rated always kind of the highest, best tagline ever made. It's still Nike's tagline 50 years after Dan Wheaton invented it, right? So I explain why is it great. And it is the synthesis of these three elements. It talks about character. It's an argument, technically a counter argument. It's emotional, right? So it's amazing that in this compactness of three words, Whedon was able to unite these three modes of Aristotle. And it's the reason why I think this is a phenomenal phrase, right? The backstory is that Nike was advertising in a bunch of different places and they had different athletes, different formats. And so Wheaton thought we need something that ties it all together. and he was watching the news, and he saw that a man named Gary Gilmore had been executed, a killer. And they asked Gilmore, "Do you have any last words?" And Gilmore said, "Yeah, let's do it." And that's it. I just need one word and it's perfect. And so he changed it. He took it to the firm. They hated it. His partner hated it. Phil Knight hated it. Everybody hated it. But because Wheaton was Wheaton, who had a character, his character history was so successful, they ran it. I show often the first Nike ad, it's called the Stack ad, right? And it's this beautiful, emotional 30-second clip of a guy named Walter Stack, an octogenarian triathlete. And Nike has been on this emotion thing, right? But I talk in the book about the famous Think Different campaign from Apple and why that worked, and which is a really interesting fusion of the character of people like Picasso and Balanchine, those different agents with the idea of Apple as a company. So yeah, I find it, especially visual art, and I try to use in the book, there's a whole section on Magritte painting called Treachery of Images, and being able to read the rhetoric in, this is not a pipe, right? It's about people.
Yeah.
His commentary on what you can believe or can't believe. So you're right. The advertising, by the way, Magritte worked in advertising. That was his day job, so to speak, before he was
I didn't know that he was in advertising, actually.
an advertising person. That's where that was his first career. And so there is that sense of commercial art that it's there. And you're right. Advertising is a phenomenal thing because it's where these worlds kind of intersect, right? The psychology, culture, business, they come together in this phenomenal forum, which is advertising.
But you brought that point up of Apple and the Think Different campaign. It's amazing how from coming as sort of underdog, they are now the undisputed sort of leader in their field, and that Think Different is totally incongruous with where the business is now. I mean, it's basically just think the same. And it's just interesting how, they've dropped that Think Different quite a while ago, whereas Nike, in terms of, you mentioned it, but yesterday I was just saying, even though it is 50 years old or whatever, like you said, it's still a great line. And I said, I was asked for a quote yesterday and I gave one, but I said, it's actually just do it. Just do it. And I was like, damn it. Nike has really got one of the best lines in English, or best phrase in the English language to just get things done. So yeah, the persuasive value of these advertising terms, can't be underestimated. Now, I want to talk a little bit about coaching because, actually, let's just go back to your book, and I just want to take out one line that you mentioned in the summary, which is about the last king of Scotland, where you talk about why Idi Amin complained to his counselor that, why didn't you tell me that if I kicked out all the Indians that I'm going to get into trouble? But the guy said, yes, I did. But he said, but you didn't persuade me.
Right.
So I love that line. And I think that's so important. We can be told 100 times, don't touch the fire, with kids in that. Right. Don't touch that. Don't put your finger in the door. But until it actually happens, they don't believe you. So that ability of persuasion to get people to do things, it's life-saving as well. It's not just from getting somebody to buy things. It can actually make an enormous impact on people's lives. This is where your coaching, I suppose.
And what I say in the book is this, right? You read books that are supposed to be a persuasion. They talk about it's about selling, closing a deal, getting some advice. And I say, I don't think that's what it is. I think it's something deeper than that. And the example I use is, let's say you love, Star Wars. You just think Star Wars is the best movie ever made. You know everything about George Lucas. You know every character. You know every line. You follow the fan literature. And then you meet me. And it turns out I also love Star Wars. At that instant, you and I become a community, right? And this is a fundamental thing in human beings. We want others to believe what we believe. We want others to love what we love. We want others to know what we know. And persuasion at the basic level is this desire to connect to other human beings. Because if we share beliefs, then we're united. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, then everything else sort of falls into place. And in the book, I was trying to explain to people what these three things are: character, argument, and emotion. And I came with this metaphor. And what I said was, based on my research, we can take someone's character, and I mean someone being the company, a brand, a person, an institution, a school, a government. And it has 7 dimensions that I talk about in the book. Then I say, think about argument. There are 7 dimensions of argument: witnesses, proofs, logic, antecedents, laws, and standards. And there are 7 kinds of emotion: positive, negative, exhortative, inspirational. Take these 7, 7, and 7, add them up, you get 21 elements. So I say the best way to think about persuasion is back to high school chemistry. It's the periodic table. And every message I've ever seen, from humans to humans, gods to humans, or humans to gods, is some combination of these 21 things, right? And so what happens is that most of these formulas are very old. Here and there you see a new one. But when the formula works, it works forever, because people don't change for the most part, right? And that's why Nike 50 years later, that formula was so good that there was no reason to change it. You can still buy aspirin. I forgot what year, 1920 something, I think aspirin was invented. It's still aspirin. So formula was good to go from out of the box. And these things persist, right? Because we still respond to the chemistry in the same way.
And just like with physics or chemistry, where we actually have some innate understanding of how things work. So, for example, if you put your finger in hot water, you know your finger's going to burn. The same thing with persuasion. Lots of us do it without, training on persuasion, and certain things work. But I take it what you're doing in the book is you're codifying some of these rules that you might already be doing. And, okay, that's why this works. That's why that doesn't work. But I want to ask you a question on persuasion, and it's because I love American politics, and I have a look at the attempts at persuasion. And I'm going to give you a task. How could you persuade Maddow on MSNBC to vote for Trump, or to change her perception about Trump, for example? Because this is not... with all of those 21 elements that you've got, I don't know what combination of elements you could have to change somebody's steadfast beliefs. How is that possible? How can you change it? Is persuasion strong enough to change beliefs, or is persuasion only useful when somebody is already predisposed to a specific path or level of understanding?
Yeah, so let's go back to the definition that Aristotle gives of the word, right, which is very important. He says, persuasion is a demonstration that something is true or seems to be true. Full stop. It's a very interesting definition. It has many implications. The most important one being, I don't persuade you. Truth persuades you, or the appearance of truth, right? So my job isn't to change your mind. My job is to get you to believe that something is true. Assuming the audience is rational. That's a big assumption, right? Assuming it's rational, then persuasion happens automatically. So then you say on any task, there are 2 things here, right? One is, why? If Rachel Maddow or anyone else believes to be true, what truth, if it's accepted, would lead them to agree willingly, not by a trick or maybe, but willingly, to go vote for Donald Trump? Right. And so if I can define that, then I can change your mind. For example, I could say, if there is now a worse candidate under more criteria than him, and therefore voting for him is the lesser of 2 evils. That's an argument that I make. That could persuade you that you're right. It is true that this other person now, in my mind, is an even worse candidate, which is, by the way, the formulation which is being used right now for people who don't like Biden. I get it. You don't like him. He's old, whatever. But look at option B, right? This is a very, very old formula, but it's still packaged and delivered as we speak to those who are not so crazy about Biden. So one other thing important here, and this is really key for startups and for executives, right, is that I said it's chemistry. Well, chemistry, if you know that I can create a medicine most medicines have certain parameters under which they're effective, right? So this one only works for children or for adults or in this particular type of cancer. They're not absolutes. And also delivery method matters. Now we get into advertising. So we have pills, we have capsules, we have liquid, we have injections, right? We have radiation. And so both of those have to be factored in. And I've seen case after case where somebody had a very nice formula, but they forgot the step before, which what must be true environmentally for it to be efficacious, right? So, and a great example was not an MBA healthcare team that was given the part to convince an inner city group to accept helmets for their kids to wear bicycles. And they had all the data, they had all the facts, all the charts, the helmets were free. And they went out to the community and the community basically ran them out of the building. They didn't even get to make the pitch, right? And I said, and they were really confused. We got ran out of the room. And these are from an elite, very, very top school. And I said, well, because you assume that it's true that people respect your school. They don't. The school has a history of exploitation and racism in this community that was first and foremost, that's the essential truth where they were starting. You ignored it. Had you addressed it, you might have had a different outcome. I find that in business, people will sometimes make a pitch and they forgot to ask themselves, for this chemistry to work, what are the conditions that must be in place for it to work? They don't think about that. It falls flat or even worse, right? And then they don't even know why they failed.
Yeah, and I like that you're putting it in chemistry terms, because you could put all the right ingredients together, so A, B, C, but you forget about the temperature, you forget about, you're using the wrong spoon, etc. And there are very smart folks out there who do all the right things, and you can look at lots of political candidates who've done the right things, but it falls absolutely flat. And it's, as you said, they haven't had a look at all the other elements around them. They haven't really, it's such a complicated thing, persuasion. And I want to talk about your coaching, because I think this is, it's very useful to see how folks can actively use persuasion and perhaps use some of the rules of persuasion techniques, or some of the rules that you've got in your book. And I see you've got sort of one-on-one coaching, team coaching, event preparation, skills assessment, pitch reviews. Now I want to talk about pitch reviews and donor messaging, because I think those are quite interesting ones. Talk to me about perhaps an example you've got of a person who came to you with a great idea but a terrible story, and how you changed them from selling a product to trying to persuade customers in the correct way.
Most of what I've done has been pitch reviews. This is what I usually get a call for, the famous elevator pitch, right?
Yeah.
So let me run my pitch to you. Let's rework the pitch. And I'll give you one, which I'm working on right now. And this happens to be a nonprofit one. But it's the founder of a very successful physician, healthcare executive, who retired a little early and then moved to Hawaii and started a foundation to protect the reefs, Environment Foundation. And she called me and said, I'm doing media interviews. They're not going well. I'm bombing. I'm getting bad reviews from the press. I'm in trouble. So I said, okay, there are three things that we have at our disposal to persuade. The character again, right? The arguments and the emotion. I said, tell me the origin story. Why did you start this foundation? And she said, well, I had retired. I was home. I was bored. My kids were gone. They didn't need me anymore. It just kept getting worse. And I said, okay, let's come to suicide note. I said, no. Those are the arguments. Give me a different version. And she had to pause, right? And after a few months of silence, I said, take your time. It's in there. Go find it. And then she said, when I was a little girl growing up in Puerto Rico, I used to watch a show called Jacques Cousteau. And it was this French guy who used to go swimming in the ocean. And I used to sit as a little girl. I couldn't move. I loved this show. And I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau when I grew up. My parents made me go to medical school. I became a doctor. But in the back of my head is Jacques Cousteau. So when I left and I retired, I went to Hawaii and I learned how to dive. And I went to this very nice reef to take pictures of fish. She said, but I'm the world's worst fish photographer. All my pictures was just the tail. Okay. Oh, he said, one day I came back and there were no fish, but the reef was there. And I realized it was so beautiful. I wasn't coming for the fish, I was coming for the reef. And at that moment, I decided I'm going to work the rest of my life to protect what I'm seeing. And I said, that's the story, right? That's the reason you do this, right? And anyone who
So that's a tear in my eye that I was wiping away with the story there. Yeah.
Join you on this journey. So I think so often where you say, why did you start this company? In fact, I'm working with a CEO of a health tech startup, right? She started this company because her husband had cancer. He died. And then she learned about clinical trials. How do you ask them as a patient? Too late. So she became committed to a health tech startup that allows patients to access clinical trials. And she's building a platform for do that. And so when I first met her, it was, again, very typical of an entrepreneur, right? A scientist, especially entrepreneur. There are all these things, inequalities in healthcare, access, and some VC had told her, don't talk about what happened to your husband. And I said, that's crazy. You know why? He said, this, you sound weepy, the VC told her. And I said to her, okay, maybe, but maybe the formula was wrong, but that doesn't mean you throw it away. You just fix the formula. And this is what I see in business, which is emotion is hard to get right. People try it, it doesn't work. So then they get told, oh, emotion shouldn't be in the pitch. No, not at all. You have to rethink it, because if you use it, it's phenomenally powerful. So with her, we reworked the whole thing carefully so that it's back in, but it's back in the right way. And suddenly it's not, it's not sentimental is the word. It's powerful. And I think back to your question of how do you get good? First of all, you understand that the ship of persuasion has 3 masts and 3 sails. And almost every executive I meet, the emotion and character sails are tied up nice and tight. And the poor argument is doing all the work and it's tattered. Let's lower that. Let's open up the other 2 a little bit. Watch the ship go faster. Watch it move with more power. And they were just sitting there waiting for you to use them.
Mm-hmm. Carlos, in persuasion, storytelling is obviously a key component of that. And obviously I can tell from the discussion that you're a master storyteller. And I think you obviously have got that. I don't know whether that's by practice or whether that's by your own formula or something that you've got innately in you. But that storytelling aspect, I'm sure it fits into just the way you're telling the story about being transfixed to the television and then wanting to be Jacques Cousteau. All of us can see that. We can immediately conjure that image in our head versus, let's save the reefs, more fish, etc. It's putting yourself into those people's shoes, not feet.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So that storytelling component is super important. What, if I can ask, in terms of storytelling techniques, do you go through any of that in your book or in your coaching sessions in terms of how to tell a persuasive story?
Yeah, so storytelling is a delivery mechanism, right? Like PowerPoint's a delivery mechanism, but an essay is a delivery mechanism. So it happens to be one that we like. So think of storytelling as a little cup of liquid. It's easy to take. It's over in a second. You can put a little flavor in it, which is not an injection. PowerPoint is like an injection. Story is like a really nice, sweet bit of medicine. So to me, it's just a delivery mechanism. And when I coach people, I explain to them, story narrative structure, it's 2 dimensions. The one axis is change. The other is time. All stories are changed over time. Right? So first question is, for somebody who's not a professional storyteller, is what changed over how much time? So let's map that out. Now let's build on that. Let's tell me the change, tell me the time. And so you can teach anyone to tell a good story if once they understand it's change over time. And as you practice, you get good. And what I find also is this, to tell like artificial stories in a way, or other people's stories, is a skill and a practice, but to tell yours is usually something anybody can do. right? This is not my story. This is her story. So maybe I told it well, but she'll tell it even better than I can. And I tell you that if I had her on video, it's better than the version I just told you because it's cool, right? And so I think that's when it comes to storytelling, is first understand the mechanics. Again, it operates by rules. Like the same CEO was asked to go and do like a TED talk, and I said, "What is your life from now and here?" And make it into 3 acts. I just said, okay, act 1 was born in China to when I did my first exit. Second act was first exit to then successful third exit. Third act is my husband gets cancer and dies to today, right? As we work through it, she told me this incredible story about being an entrepreneur. She said she went to China, got a master's degree, came to Silicon Valley, got hired as employee number 20 in a startup. She works with a startup, and then they have an exit a few years later. So she goes to find out what her package is worth with HR. And she says, Carlos, she never once used my name. I was engineer level 4. So sit down, engineer level 4. Here's what your package is worth. She said, I was in her office for 1 hour, and she never used my name. She just called me engineer level 4. And here I thought, I'm employee 20. I got a first name in my email. I'm one of the key people in the journey. And she said, that day, I said, I will never not be the founder, right? And I said, yeah, you'd rather be a poor carpenter than a rich hammer. She said, that's exactly right. And so her whole life changes at this moment, right? And it was a success story in paper, but as an entrepreneur, entrepreneur will get this. That here you thought you were a reason for the success, but the people the VCs and everybody else, you're like, okay, engineer level 4, right? You get this much. That's the simple thing of saying to her, break your life into 3 acts, like a play. Once she saw that, then, okay, here's my story. Change over time. Here's my story. So there are these techniques of basics. I'm talking about like writing a novel. I'm just mean just basic storytelling that once you understand them, you apply them. And then the more you apply them, the easier it is. They become ingrained in how you think about things, right? And so that's how somebody becomes a good storyteller. If you ever talk to a stand-up comic, it takes years for them. They spend years honing and honing. You see the finished craft. You didn't see all the nights that were terrible. So it's like any good skill. It's a little bit of practice, right?
Does it ever stagger and amaze you that people don't know their own story or haven't thought about their own story?
It's remarkable. And there's this terrible piece of advice, which is you shouldn't be part of the story. When Aristotle says the opposite, of the 3 things, perhaps the most important is the person speaking to you. And I always say, within the 7 parts of character, the most important is origin. The story I tell is we're at an airport and our flight gets canceled. And we're in Oslo and there's a storm. So we're stuck in Oslo. And we're both looking at the big board that's cancel. As you and I stand next to each other, we could be from anywhere in the world. So now it turns out, hey, we're not. We're both from the Northern Hemisphere. Guess what? We're both from the Americas. Guess what? We're from the same state. Guess what? The same part of the city. Guess what? The same neighborhood. Guess what? The same section of the street. By the time we're done narrowing the world, you grew up across the street from me. I just never met you. At that instant, I want to believe anything you tell me. There's this powerful thing. And by the way, the more elite or tribal the organization, the more important this is. That's why military people are very focused on origin. Elite universities, what did you study? Who trained you, right? This is just a strange thing about people. It goes back, I'm sure, to early, long time ago, where being part of the same group meant life and death, but it persists. We have this strange thing of we want to believe those who share origin with us. And I had a call today with somebody, and they saw on my thing that I had been an Accenture, and he said, I took the call because you were an Accenture. And I know Accenture people. So yeah, it surprised me that this is phenomenally powerful thing goes unused by most business people.
Well, except from folks who've been to Harvard, because how do you know somebody's been to Harvard, Carlos?
How do you know?
They tell you. so, so,
Can't tell on air.
so yeah, I teach students, and it's incredibly difficult for them to tell their own story and tell a compelling story about themselves. People don't believe that their story is interesting until somebody else squeezes it out of them or draws it out of them. And that's what coaching does. And I see that in my teaching role as well, as coaching people and trying to get them to say, every single one of you is unique and have a unique story to tell. And this is going to impact on how people see you and how you deal with the world and how you deal with challenges. So it's very exciting. Embrace it. No matter how mundane, there's something that you've done that is going to be interesting to a category of people. And I just hope people listening sit down and write the 3 acts that you've mentioned. I think that's a super exercise and something that most people can't give an elevator pitch on themselves. They cannot talk about themselves for 1 minute. I will put money out there that somebody can't, without a gap or a pause, talk 1 minute about themselves properly.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I have never had a person I've coached whom we couldn't find something in their story that didn't make the pitch better. Not one time, not even the person, if you had met, well, this is the most serious, buttoned up person. From the very first client to my latest, there is always something in who you are. You're exactly right, Nicholas, which is going to make your pitch more persuasive and make you a better communicator. It's sitting there waiting for you to use it. And it belongs only to you. I can't use it. You can't use it. Only they can use it. Right? So if you don't use it, no one else will.
Absolutely. Now, talking about storytelling, I think anyone listening can hear that you just want to tell stories. It's bubbling out of you.
Well, storytelling.
Well, I see you've got 2 new books coming up as well, The Long Eclipse and The Trauma Boundary. So these have got timelines in them. So I suppose publishers or your wife or kids in that are keeping you to a schedule. So talk to me about your writing. So let's go away from persuasion quickly and just go into these.
So The Long Eclipse is my first fiction. So it's a novel. And it was what I originally set out to write. And it's a novel. It's a fictionalized account based on a real person, a guy named Giovanni Falcone. So Giovanni Falcone was a judge in Italy in the 1980s. And he's a legend in Italy because he was the person who took on organized crime in Italy in the 1980s. And that's what was known as the maxi trial, where they put 1,000 people on trial at the same time, a remarkable story. And so Falcone, very complicated person. And I was shocked that no one had told his story in America in sort of fictionalized form. It's just an amazing story. The limits of heroism. Because it's one thing to put your life at risk for a cause, right, or a job. The question becomes, what about your wife? What about your husband? What about your children? Do you have the right to put them, to make that choice for them? So it examines the relationship between Paolo as the character and his wife as he takes on this fight, knowing that it could cause the death of him and his family. And what are the limits of heroism? The Trauma Boundary is in some ways the follow-up to Persuasion because it's my dissertation thesis. I argue in the book that whenever there's an extreme trauma, whether it's political or personal, but especially political, for example, in America, school shooting, that we place a boundary around it. And then we talk about it at a distance behind the boundary. Right? We don't want anyone crossing that boundary. And so if you cross it, you can be punished for it, or in some cases you can pay a very deep psychological price. You can go insane for living in this space between the actual reality and the boundary. And then the last element is that control of the boundary becomes phenomenally important. Right? In fact, this weekend I'm writing a guest essay for New York Times on the book the movie Zone of Interest, which is the movie there now about the movie about Glazer's movie about the concentration camp leader. And the whole movie is shot outside the boundary in the house. Right. And so here we see a physical boundary in the film, right? And sometimes the boundary is actually a physical thing. Sometimes it's mental. So the trauma boundary explains that this boundary exists, how it functions, and how politicians and different agents try to control it, because by controlling it, we control understanding of what something is or perception, right? Think about in the US, Guantanamo. So Guantanamo is the phenomenal case study of the US government creating a trauma boundary. They created a boundary around the trauma that was happening inside of that place, right? And they've done a very good job of keeping the boundary intact. Most Americans don't think about it. It's still there. There are still people locked up there, but it isn't part of the consciousness because the boundary is so well constructed that whatever is happening to the side, people don't want to know. So yeah, that's the trauma.
So those are quite heavy concepts. I mean, from, dealing with the mob in Italy to the trauma boundaries that you're speaking about. So how do you keep your mental health? This will be our last question for tonight. But how do you keep your mental health sort of positive when dealing with quite complex issues like this, which do have real world implications and that a lot of people aren't aware of? Do you feel that you are sitting alone in an empty room sometimes, that nobody gets you?
I definitely sit alone in a room most of the time. You do for a living. I said I read and except when I'm at school, right? But other than that, I read and write. Yeah, it's the nature of writing that it's a solitary activity for the most part, right? So it is very difficult. And one reason I like doing podcasts is just simply a chance to talk about the work, and because you can become very isolated in the ideas and the writing. I have a newsletter on Slack, so I write about art and culture. So that's called Critic at Large, and I talk about movies and plays, and I did a whole thing on Godzilla -1. So that's a very more lighthearted, and then I'm a musician.
I saw you play the piano and that you specialize in
Bill Evans.
Bill Evans. I'm not a big jazz person. The most jazzy I get is Dave Brubeck, who I absolutely love. And I was listening to this chap, and I heard some sort of similarities, both, great tone on the piano. So hopefully we're going to hear some of your practice sessions or your own pieces on sound.
Yeah. You can actually, because in my last post on Substack, I wrote about a Japanese composer who died last year, Rich Sakamoto, who was one of my composers. And as my little homage, I recorded one of his pieces that I learned, and I made a video of it and put it on YouTube. So it's my only music video.
Okay.
Me playing a piece called Fountain by Sakamoto, which you can look up. Fountain.
I'm very fond of Japanese composers. So what I'm going to suggest is that I'm happy to end off next week's, when this podcast comes out, with a couple of bars of you playing something. So if you send me something that is non-copyright and send it to me, I will use that
from YouTube. That's my arrangement. Right. So
please send that, and then we'll use that to close out this episode. But Carlos, what a treat speaking to you. And I'm looking forward to seeing these 2 books coming out as well. I think Long Eclipse is coming out next year, and Trauma Boundary in 2028. So we've got a couple of years until that comes out. And last but not least, where can folks get in touch with you if they want to check out your coaching or buy your book?
CarlosAlvarenga.com.
Okay.
All my publications, past and present, are there, and you can actually contact me right from the website.
Great.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic weekend.
Nicholas, thank you so much for having me on.
Now, before we wrap up, don't forget to show some love for From Startup to Wunderbrand by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. If you'd like to help us grow, tell your friends, share on social media, and leave us a review. Let's connect and chat about all things branding and digital. Until next time.